Last tutorial we were seeing what classes are, what properties and methods were all about. Um, what was that again? What objects are, right? How to define classes, its properties and its methods, and how to instantiate that class in PHP. So in this tutorial, we are going to just dive into constructors, destructors, and access modifiers in PHP, right? I think I had already made some little hints about what they were all about, and we said constructors were used to um, to lay a base from where we can initialize objects when we define them. So constructors, like we said, is used to initialize an object's properties when you create them, right? So that initially when you create an object, it comes with some properties. So you use the constructor keyword or the construct keyword in your class to actually define the properties that you want to initially define when you're creating your object. So now if you create a construct function within your PHP class, this function will automatically be called when you instantiate a class, right? So in other words, to simplify it, constructors in PHP are used to initialize instances, or they are used to initialize the initial properties of our objects. Now, I think you already understand what objects are in PHP. Let's check out this code. You have the person class, and this person class has the person's name and the age as properties, and it has two other methods, the get name and the get age. There is another special property or special method here that we have called the construct, right? This is called the constructor. So within this method, you should take note of what is there. You define the function, then you have double underscore, that is underscore underscore, then construct. Now this one takes in some parameters or arguments. These arguments are what you want to initially define when you actually instantiate a class, right? So in this case, we have our person class, and the constructor is taking in the name and the age, right? And it sets the name to the initial name and the age of the person. So that when you call this class, when you instantiate this class, uh, and pass in maybe these values, it takes these values and sets it to be this name and this age. I hope that was clear enough. This is an error here, though it's not. Our age is supposed to be an integer. We'll get to that. So now you see that when you instantiate the person class, you just pass in this argument. But initially in our previous example, you saw that we actually defined a setter and a getter, like another function to set the name and another function to get the name. But in this function, we did not define any function or any method. This when we are talking about OOP or object-oriented programming, we no longer talk about functions, we talk about methods. So in this class, we no longer define the methods to set the name and to set the age. We just define a constructor that will take in the age and the name at once. And here you see that your code is now shorter, like you no longer write chunks of code, right? So you see, the constructor helps you to firstly initialize some values when you call your function, when you instantiate your class, and it also helps to reduce the amount of code you write. Imagine that the person class had the first name, the last name, the email, the date of birth, and so on. You will definitely want to define many methods, maybe set name, set email, set date of birth, and so on. But with a constructor, you just need to pass in these arguments, and uses this the name, this the age to set those initial values, and then you instantiate here and pass in those values, right? So constructor helps to reduce the amount of code you write. Now I'm going to switch to my editor, and we're actually going to see that. So if you notice, I've actually changed the structure of my VS Code because I discovered that it was not visible. If you notice, we have the person class. This person class has two properties, the name and the age, and we have a constructor here. Please notice the way it is defined. Two underscores and then this construct keyword. This is a keyword in PHP, right? You don't need to use any other word that is different from this. You use exactly the same way it is. Then I've passed in two arguments. In your case, it might be more than two or maybe just one or whatever. And then I set it to be these values here. Now I have two other methods, the get name and the get age, that will return the name and the age when I call my constructor. Now I also defined a new instance and call it person1, and I pass in the name as John and the age as 25. Then this one I am echoing out the name and the age, right? So what you were initially supposed to actually check out is how to define this constructor and how to use it here. So you see, when I define my person class, right, you see that when I highlight on the person, when I hover on the person class, you see this pop up. It has a constructor that takes in the name and the age. Now if I run this function php constructors php, sorry, we are not inside the uh, folder, so I'll call it object. Let me enter the function, the folder object oriented programming clear, and then I'm php constructors.php. You see that it prints out the name and the age. So this is how you will define your constructor. Constructors, like I said, are really very, very important because it will help to reduce the amount of code you write. The next thing we'll talk about is destructors in PHP. Just like constructors, destructors are automatically called at the end of your instantiation, right? So maybe when you've instantiated your values, for example, and you have called the instance, immediately that instance finish running, the destructor class will be called, and this destructor class, what it does is it unsets all the values. It's like uh, destroying a session, right? It's likened to that. So your destructor is called when the object is destructed, right, or when the script has stopped being executed. So it's not always necessary to call the destructor, but it's a good practice to always call it when, especially in PHP, so that you don't have to you don't get to keep data in memory to occupy a lot of space, right? So same as the constructor, you use the destruct keyword, and you don't need to pass in the arguments. You just call the destruct keyword. What happens is when you call this function, it unsets all the values that you've passed in here once the object has finished executing. All right, so let me switch to my code editor and go to destructors.php. Now you're going to notice something. In this class, I have defined the person, right? And this person class has the name, and I'm still going to call it the age, right? Age, age, and age, get age. Alright, I'm just trying to refactor my code because I initially set color instead of age. So this is my initial constructor. We talked about constructor just some few minutes ago. And now I have a destructor that has been called. Now I also have two other methods, which is to get the name and the age, just as we had it in the other tutorial, the other some few minutes back. This peculiar thing about this is that immediately I call this function or these methods, right? To get when I initialize this person one, I'm passing the name and say the age 25. They are going to execute, but after the execution is finished, this method is going to be called, right? Meaning that it is going to now destroy those values, right? It's important because it is used to free memory. So if I run destructors, PHP destructors PHP, and I execute, you actually see, sorry, this is supposed to be a slash n, and let me put another slash n here. That is out, and instructors of PHP. So you see that the name and the age has been printed out, and the destructor has been called. It means that this instance no longer exists, right? So the destructor is used to clear the memory of the various objects that you already created. It's sometimes important, it's sometimes not important. So what you are advised to do is actually to research on when to use constructors, when to use destructors in PHP, right? That is it about destructors. The next thing we are going to end with is going to be access modifiers in PHP. Now, properties and methods can have access modifiers which control where they can be accessed. Within our class, maybe the person class, maybe we don't want the name and the age to be uh, easily accessible. So we use access modifiers. Now, there are three main access modifiers in PHP, object-oriented PHP to be precise. You have the public property or method can be accessed from everywhere, maybe within the class or out of the class. So if we have a class called person and we pass in one of the property or one of the methods and make it public, it means that even out of that class, when we instantiate it, we can have access to that property and the method. The protected property or method can be accessed within the class and by classes derived from that class, right? So when we say protected, we mean that okay, we have locked this particular property or method to this particular class, or maybe to classes that inherit from this class. But when we use the private modifier, we are simply saying that this property or method can only be accessed within this class and nowhere else. Now, take note of this example. We have a class called person, and this class called person has three properties. You have the name, which is public, you have the age, which is protected, and you have the height, which is private. Now, if we instantiate this person and we try to access them directly, you actually get errors. I'll switch to my editor and we check on access modifier just to. Now we're having errors because the person class already existed somewhere. So I might change this to um, let's say people. I'll call this uh, people, right? Just to make sure that we don't have errors. So now, if you notice what has happened, if we run this code right now, because it is the same thing, I think it shouldn't be a problem understanding because We just define a class with some properties, and we are trying to directly get access to these classes properties. Now when we run this, clear and PHP modifiers, what's the name? Access modifiers PHP. When we run this, you actually get a lot of errors. Uncaught error cannot access protected age, right? And the only thing, let me highlight, let me comment this and try rerunning this so that you see. So okay, I'm going to echo it out. Echo lesson one name, right? Just to make sure that we have something printed on the screen. You see blessing because we've set the name here. Now there is something you should notice. When we were actually talking about classes, we did not say how we can access a class's property and method directly. This is how you do that. If you don't want to define getters and setters, that will only be applicable when all your properties and methods are public. You can directly access them like this. Now, but in cases where they are protected or private, you cannot. That is why if I comment this, let me comment this and uncomment this one. Comment this, right? So that if we run them, you see you get error. Now the question is, how do you fix this, right? So to access private properties and methods within a class out of that particular class, what you need to do is to define the getters and setters for that class. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a function here and call it get say age, and I'll pass in, sorry, um let me first get the set age, and I'll pass in the age, and here I'm just going to set the age, this age equal to age, right? I also do the same thing for set height, and I'll pass in the height and set this dot height equal to height, right? And now we can actually access this by not specifying this. We are rather now going to put a person one set age 25, and if I print person one, dot get age, we'll actually get to see something printed on the screen, right? So if we define property get age, do we have a getter for age? We don't have the getters. Function get age, now return this age, right? And the same thing applies for get name. For example, is it name or height? Function get height, return the same thing, return is right. Like if I call this now, we'll no longer see a stack trace. We're actually going to let me print it out. Echo. So you see that we're able now to actually get the person's height and the all the other properties. Access modifiers are one of the security methods that object-oriented programming uses. You cannot have access to all the properties and methods of a particular class unless you maybe, for example, you're actually somebody who has the code and so on. This is important in cases where hackers get in and they want to get direct information from your class's data. You see, so you use access modifiers for security, and like I just showed you, if you define things private, you have to explicitly define a way to get those methods and those properties within your class in order for you to actually use them out of the class, right? I hope that was clear enough. I'm going to undo this. I don't think I should undo. I should just copy before undoing. Okay, good. So yes, this is where we were before, right? So you get errors when you're trying to access this method and properties directly within your class when they are private or protected. Now I'm going to create another file called access modifier. How do I put it? Solution. .php. Now, since you are having issues accessing those values that are private and protected, now this code that I am pasting is the same code. What just happened? Check. Let me come back to this. Oh, I'm still going to define those same things. I thought I copied it, and since I did not copy it, I think we did it before. You just need to backward the video and see how we did that, and then I'm going to push the code together when I'm done with it so that you actually see how to use a protected and private when using access modifiers in PHP. I hope this was clear enough. If you have any question, don't hesitate to drop them, and try to practice as much as possible when it comes to this particular topic in PHP. I'll see you in the next tutorial.